Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we are going to continue our breakdown of the ARB professional criteria. Today we're looking at PC3, so let's go. Okay, so PC3 is legal framework and processes. This is a little bit more in depth even than the previous one. PC2, you'll have seen that I kind of skated over things a little bit more high level. This time is going to be even more the same. So a lot of the time I'm going to link you to further information in the description or try and be high level myself. If you need more information, then do let me know in the comments below. But essentially all of these topics lead to a load more information, and it's impossible to just cover that really lightly. Well, in the way that I'm trying to broadly cover this. So essentially I'm going to try again to break down the 10 subpoints into whether you're likely to have covered them in your professional practice or whether there's something you're going to need to revise for your part 3 and that you'll get taught at part 3, just so that you know whether or not that you already know them or whether it's likely that you do. We'll cover just generally what they are. But yeah, basically it's kind of high level, so this is a bit of an excuse for that. So let's get started. First up is 3.1, which is the relevant UK legal planning system, civil liabilities and laws of contract and tort (delict *) underneath it says Scotland. So it's a really simple, quick one to start with, obviously. I'm not a construction law or contract law or legal, just generally I'm not a lawyer. So I'm not going to give you a lot of information on the breakdown of these. We're going to just discuss them very lightly, and there's going to be more reading below. I'm kind of going to try and dodge this one. A lot of this is also in the rest of these subpoints, so we'll come to them as we do. But basically, the UK legal system, obviously a massive topic, civil liabilities as well. I recommend you read the construction law, the yellow book that I mentioned in my part 3 reading list, because it gives a really good basis of law in England and what the law is and what it covers. Laws of contract we dealt with a little bit in PC2, but also it's like laws of contract in terms of construction contracts, which we'll deal with more in PC5. So this one sits kind of between the two. And then tort and delict. So delict is what tort is called in Scottish law. I was educated in Scotland, so we were taught about delict. Essentially, they're very, very similar, so we're going to treat them as if they're back to back. In this video, we're going to talk about tort, and we're going to use English, Welsh, Northern Irish law for that. And Scottish law uses delict, as I say, but essentially they're interchangeable. So for tort is a bit of an easier thing just to cover quite quickly. Essentially, it's a common law thing, a way to claim either through contract or if you're not in a contract with someone. And there's 3 main things that are covered under tort law, or things that are claimed for under tort tend to fall into these topics, which is negligence, which we covered in PC2, nuisance, or trespass. And trespass obviously is relevant here in terms of land law, which we're going to get to in 3.4. Sorry, I'm looking over there because that's my screen with the list on. So I'm sorry if that's really distracting. But yeah, we're going to cover that a little bit more there. And we covered also it slightly in PC2. But there is a hella load more reading all of these, and you will be taught law in a lot more detail during your part 3. So I recommend you read the RBA Law in Practice and also the Construction Law book. These are 2 great books that really talk about construction law in a way that's easy to understand, and they're kind of definitely essential reading. So it's unlikely that you have touched on these specifically in your practice. 3.1 is something that you're likely to be taught at part 3 or that you need to do additional reading for, but everything under them feeds back into them, as you often find with the professional criteria. They're kind of all referencing each other. So you'll be aware of certain points, but not all points. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, so 3.2 is Planning and Conservation Act Guidance and Processes. So we're going to talk a little bit more about conservation under 3.9, which is historic buildings legislation. But basically, I'm going to give you some of the main acts in terms of planning and conservation legislation. And the guidance you're probably aware of already, and the processes you're probably aware of already, because these are things that you will do in day-to-day practice in terms of planning and conservation. So the main Planning and Conservation Acts that you should look at, but not exhaustive, is the Town and Country Planning Act, which was originally set up in 1947, and then the latest revision being 1990, which included more provisions for listed buildings and things. Planning Act 2008, which introduced the system of appeals that we have right now, and CILs, community infrastructure levies that councils are allowed to charge. Housing and Planning Act 2016, Neighbourhood Planning Act 2017, and Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit more detail in the historic buildings legislation, because I think that's a better place to cover it. But basically, if we move on to guidance for planning is obviously the NPPF, which is the National Planning Policy Framework. That's the government's planning guidance, and then it's underpinned by all local authorities with their own local plans, so they all fulfill their own local plans. Recently also, then there's been the National Design Guide, which again is from the government, and under it sits local design guides from each of the local authorities. They don't all have local design guides yet, but those are kind of in process. That's a whole different video if you want to get to that. So then obviously most of the processes part can be dealt with by looking at the planning portal, what kinds of applications you can make and what kinds of permissions you can get, and what kinds of permissions and things aren't able to be got through the planning portal that you have to apply directly to the local authority for as well. Also, the processes in terms of appeals and the planning inspectorate are things that you should be aware of as well. Again, the planning portal linked below has a lot of information on all of this if you don't get what I'm talking about. But I think some of this, if you're doing planning applications in your day-to-day work, you're likely to have touched on and have an awareness of, but you just need to fulfill a bit more awareness for your part 3 of more kinds of applications and also the legal framework under which they sit. Okay, 3.3 is building regulations, approved documents and standards, guidance and processes. So we're currently using the Building Regulations 2010, that's the legislation for building regulations, and understanding that there's actually like legal legislation for building regulations and approved documents, and that they're different is probably the main thing here. So approved documents are just guidance on ways of achieving designs that meet the building regulations, but they're actually separate things. So that kind of covers the guidance as well. And then processes is how you do that. So there's two main kinds of building regulation applications, either a full plans application or building notice application, which is done usually directly by the contractor. And there's two kinds of inspectors as well. You can have an approved inspector or a local authority inspector who come to site and check that it is in accordance with building regulations. That's a massive general overview, but this is something that you may well have experience of in practice if you're doing building regulations applications or building regulation drawings for people, or even construction drawings. They'll all have been through this process. So you'll have an awareness. Again, it's just fulfilling your legal awareness really for part 3. And again, this will all be touched on in your part 3 course too. So you can reference some awareness of it in your PEDR, but also aware that you need to learn more probably, and that there'll be additional learning to be done when you do your part 3. 3.4 is land law, property law, and rights of other proprietors. Again, kind of a major topic. Again, construction law, the Yellow Book, great introduction to a lot of these things. Some of this you're going to be aware of probably from your work, and some of it, again, is just additional learning. This PC3 specifically is quite like that because they want you to understand the legal side of it, but also you'll probably already understand at least part of what it means day to day for an architect. So in terms of land law, obviously we have things like the land registry that records who owns certain land and what the boundary of it is. Not exclusively, however, at least not in England. Sometimes there's just things missing from the land registry. Also the types of ownership of that land, whether freehold or leasehold, they're the main two types. Having awareness of those, the difference between them, is important. Then the boundaries comes into other laws, such as the Party Wall Act, when you're building on or adjacent to a boundary, how that is dealt with, the Party Wall Agreement situation. So that's another law that you need to be aware of. And then covenants, which is to do or to refrain from doing something, which is usually an agreement between two parties. Often we ask this when we start a new job with a client. Are they aware of any covenants? Because this is something that you need to maintain or be aware of legally, because it's something that comes with the property usually. Same things for curtilage or right of access, easements, bridleways or way leaves. All of those are kind of things to do with rights of access over land for people, or for rights of somebody who owns land. So then there's the rights of other proprietors. So this specifically, in my reading of it, is that it refers to Access and Neighbouring Land Act 1992. This is where neighbours have rights to access adjoining land to carry out preservation work or like remedial work to their property. This is one of the reasons why there's not often new homes built out to boundaries and things. You have access from either side for maintenance. This doesn't usually cover construction, however. If someone wants to construct on their land and needs to use yours to access it, then that is usually done through a separate permission, which would usually come along with a payment for them being allowed to do that. And then, of course, all of those, land law, property law, and rights of other proprietors, lead into one of the claims through tort, which is trespass. And so obviously trespass is the security of a person's body, property or land, an intrusion upon land without right or permission. So even if there's a covenant or like an easement in place, people can trespass if they are using that land not in accordance with that easement or covenant. So this is why as an architect we're kind of aware of those things, and also trespass. You'll definitely be taught about these things in your part 3, and you might have some experience of them. So it's always good in your PEDR to highlight this if you come across a property that you're working on that has specific or onerous like covenants or way leaves or easements on it. These are really good to bring up in your PEDR and say, I'm aware of this and it's a really specific kind of land law issue. If you're doing party wall agreements, again, great, it's kind of part of this, so it's part of PC3. So they're just some good examples, but don't worry if you're not seeing it in practice. It's something that you will be taught at your part 3, but it's something that you should always be reading around as well. And yeah, the construction law book is excellent on all of this. Okay, 3.5 is terms within construction contracts implied by statute. This is something you're very unlikely, I'd say, to be aware of in practice as a part 1 or part 2, and it's something that you will be taught specifically or part 3. I am not a lawyer, as I've already said, and so I'm going to give you a very basic understanding of my understanding of what this is, and also there'll be some additional reading below, and if there's additional reading, I'll tell you which of the 1 to 10 criteria I think that reading's for, but loads of reading around topics is what you need to do for your part 3 anyway. So the simplest way of me explaining this as not a lawyer is that you can't have contracts that are unfair, essentially, or that don't fulfill all of the requirements that they're subject to. And if they, for some reason, don't, or they try and write out specific things, those things can be implied back in statute because they're just things that you can't not do. So one example of this is one I'm going to read to you, which is a construction contract under the Construction Act must comply with statutory provisions for payment, suspension, and adjudication terms. If it doesn't, the Scheme for Construction Contracts 1998 will be implied piecemeal into the contract, with the parties being unable to opt out. So basically, it's when you remove certain clauses or provisions from a contract that you can't legally do because it affects the efficacy of that contract. These things can be implied back if you ever claim on that contract, essentially, even if they tried to remove them. So essentially it's that, but you will be taught a lot more construction law and contract law during your part 3. But if you can see any of the contracts you're using in practice, that would be great. Standard contracts, such as like NEC, JCT, or RIBA ones, are standardly like using and referring to all statutes that they need to anyway, so they're not having this problem. From my unprofessional opinion of this, not a lawyer, I'd say it would tend to be bespoke contracts that try and particularly write out certain provisions that would be subject to things being implied back by statute. But some of these things, even if the contract mentions them, they're implied by statute rather than the contract itself. Anyway, you'll come on to that in your part 3, but that's essentially what it means, and it's very unlikely you know that already. So this is something that you would read up on for your part 3 and that you'll be taught for your part 3, so don't worry about it. 3.6 is health and safety legislation and regulations. So the first thing we're going to mention is the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Health and Safety Executive. So below is linked the Health and Safety Executive's information on the Health and Safety at Work Act and all the subsequent legislation that sits under that as well. An HSE, basically, obviously, the Health and Safety Executive is the body that governs all of that, and health and safety in work, in construction, everything in the UK. The health and safety legislation that's most relevant to you as an architect is CDM 2015. So this is Construction Design Management Regulations 2015, which you will probably be using in practice already. You're probably aware of the roles of like principal designer, principal contractor, etc. The health and safety file with the project, all of that. Again, you should read up more on this and you will be taught more about it at part 3, but it's likely something that you are doing in practice. And if you're not getting a chance to do that, you should speak to your workplace mentor and say, can I see more of what we do for CDM 2015, please? And also see how it's referenced in your contracts with clients and things like that. That's all great to do. The thing to remember about CDM 2015 is it applies to all projects, regardless of whether they're domestic or commercial. But if it's notifiable, then there is subsequent legislation that you must comply with as well. Regulation 6 of CDM 2015 is what tells us whether or not it's notifiable, and the F10 form is how you tell HSE, Health and Safety Executive, that it is a notifiable project. This is something that I was asked in my interview, like what is the F10 and when do you do it? So I'm going to tell you when you do it. I'm just going to read you this bit so that you know. So an F10 notification, so when you need to fill out this project form, is when work is likely to last longer than 30 working days and have more than 20 workers working simultaneously at any point in the project, or exceed 500 person days. So it's those two qualifiers is when a project is notifiable, and then you need to fill out the F10 form, send it to the HSE, and then they're aware that that work is happening and that it is notifiable as a project. It's subject to further legislation also under CDM 2015. So that is a general overview. You probably do know about this. There's loads of books on the topic as well, some of which I think I mentioned in my part 3 books too. But if you can get more experience of it in the workplace, because that always helps it really helps me to understand when you see this legislation in action, you understand what it means, but you will be taught it even more in your part 3 as well. 3.7 is statutory undertakers and authorities, their requirements and processes. So the simplest way to explain this is, it is probably something that you've come across. Statutory undertakers is any authority is authorities that are doing public functions. So that includes, for example, the Civil Aviation Authority, the Post Office, electric, gas, water suppliers, the Highways Agency, Environment Agency as well. Checking my notes. All these guys. So if you are doing planning applications in your work, then you will have obviously seen that usually you'll get responses from some of these groups. So depending on what the application is for, you might have a response from the Highways Agency about whether that access is safe, whether it is causing any issues with access more widely, more broadly, and whether they support or don't support the application as it stands. The Environment Agency, same thing, same responses. So that's all kind of within planning. Their requirements from planning and processes is usually that they will comment on those applications. However, there is specific things that you can require from them that's outside of a planning authority, such as from the Environment Agency. I'm going to drop further information below about those too, but that's generally what that means. That's who they are. So if you're reading thinking, I don't know what the hell these things are, what statutory undertakers or authorities are, it's essentially those groups which will usually be asked to consult on any planning application anyway, but there might be other relationships that you need to have with them depending on the scale and the type of the project. Okay, and following on from that a little bit is 3.8, which is environmental and sustainability legislation. In terms of this, there used to be the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was then withdrawn. At the moment, the main environmental and sustainability legislation is done through the building regulations, and there is obviously there is a update to the building regulations coming now in 2022, if you're watching way in the future for some reason. So that's going to deal with a lot more of the environmental and sustainability legislation that the government wants to bring in about reducing water use and energy use and all those kind of things, making homes better. A lot of architectural firms and engineers commented on this legislation early on and tried to implore the government not to reduce the building regulations requirements, but to increase them, so that we were asking for sort of better performing buildings. Even then, the building regulations is going to be the minimum standard. So that's in terms of legislation. Obviously, we know that in terms of sustainability, there's also things like LEED, BREEAM, or BREEAM, yeah, Passive House, Enefit ratings, those kind of things that are above building regs by quite a considerable length, and trying to make better sustainable buildings and better environmentally friendly buildings. Those are really the standards we should be working to, rather than building regulations, which still are kind of, in my opinion, kind of woefully short of where we should be to hit targets. So also in terms of environmental, there is the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which more deals with ecology, but I would put it under this as well. You will know if you've been doing planning applications that often you'll need to have surveys to check the sort of ecological situation of a site, whether there's bats there, whether it's, you're damaging biodiversity and things by building on it, etc., etc. So these are all things that are also part of the legislation, because the Wildlife and Countryside Act has provisions in it where disturbing creatures that are protected species is illegal. So essentially that's also another part of this, probably one that you're more aware of too in terms of your day-to-day life in the office. So again, this is another topic where you probably are aware of most of the legislation, at least in terms of building regs. You may and hopefully are doing buildings that are either BREEAM, LEED, or Passive House accredited, and also you'll definitely be aware of protected species and sort of ecological surveys and things required for planning application, but also throughout the construction process, how that is used throughout the construction process to manage mitigate any risk to any protected species or to damaging biodiversity of an area. So that's essentially what that means, that you probably already know, but again, for part 3 there'll be a little bit more reading on it. Make sure that you know the legislation as well. Okay, 3.9 is historic buildings legislation, which, as I said, we'd come back to a little bit more. Here, I think there's kind of two major things. There's the Ancient Monument and Archaeological Areas Act, which is 1979, which deals with scheduled ancient monuments that sit kind of above the grade listings in the UK, so they're even more special sites or archaeologically interesting sites. And then Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990, as we said, covers listed buildings too. There is a presumption in planning that there will be the preservation of special architectural or historic interest features or buildings, particularly listed buildings are the onus is on them to be preserved rather than affected, and therefore listed building consent is required. We're going to go back in my notes to cover this. So Historic England is in charge of those. They hold the list of listed buildings in England. In Scotland, we have Historic Scotland that does the same. In England, there's 3 grade listed for buildings. Obviously, we've said scheduled ancient monuments is above that. And then there's grade 1, the highest listing, grade 2 star and 2. And I think 90% of the buildings in England are grade 2 listed. So that's quite common to be doing that and needing to do listed building consent for those. And in Scotland, it's a similar system. The naming is just different. So grade A for the highest protected, B+, and then B. So yeah, basically listing protects the interior and the exterior, and the listing itself might mention specific features that are of special interest in that building, but the whole thing and its curtilage is protected. And you need listed building consent in order to do anything inside or outside to that building, separate from planning. So if you're doing something that then requires planning permission, that would be in addition. You'd need planning permission and listed building consent. But even if you want to do something internally, you need listed building consent because it's a listed building. And like with the protected species, it's illegal to do anything to a listed building without listed building consent. So that's something to be aware of, obviously, as an architect and for your clients. If you're working in a practice that does a lot of conservation or heritage work, you're probably already aware of this, aware of listed building consent, the requirement for heritage statements, the standard naming that Historic England use. I can link that below if you are interested. But yeah, basically that covers that topic. And if you do it in practice, that's great. If your practice does things like that, but you're not involved, do ask your workplace mentor if you can have more experience of it. And if not, it's something that you can learn and read around for your part 3 as well. Okay, finally is 3.10, which is accessibility and inclusion legislation. Okay, so this refers to a few different things, but basically the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, talks about inclusion accessibility and how design and buildings should respond to that. There's the building regs, particularly Part M, which talks about accessibility as well. The Equalities Act 2010, which obviously we're all legally bound by. Principles of Inclusive Design, which was by the CABE in 2006, which sets out best practice for inclusive design. And then there may be SPGs, that's special planning guidance by local authorities. So London, for example, has more guidance on accessibility and inclusion. London is certainly more advanced than elsewhere in the UK in terms of its planning policy on accessibility and inclusion, but the rest of the UK can also copy those guidance and use those as well if you're trying to do something that's a little bit better, but really you're only referring to the NPPF or the building regulations to do legally accessible buildings. There used to be the lifetime home standard that was referenced in London till 2016. You can still use that standard and read that standard. I think that's a really good example of accessibility, but now all of that stuff's kind of, legally you only need to be compliant with building regulations. In my opinion, we could expand this quite a lot more. I think minimum space standards need to be brought back and all that kind of stuff, but now we're just going into my own personal opinion. So 3.10 is something that you may have come across in your professional practice, especially if you're designing buildings like residential blocks that need to have different mixes of different kinds of units. And if you haven't, it's something you can read around and get to grips with a bit more. But mainly the first 2 things to read is the NPPF and also the Part M building regs. Okay, guys, so that covers PC3. I think it was a little bit more of a fast run through, even than for PC2 and PC1, and PC4 and 5 are probably likely to be similar. I don't want to be too exhaustive with things or go into things in too much detail because I want to try and keep these videos short and just really tell you whether or not it's likely you've already come across this kind of thing in your work or whether it's something that you're likely to need to learn more about for your part 3. So there's definitely going to be things that I've missed. So that's why there's additional reading below. Do check that out. But if there's something you'd like more information on that I've not covered or really badly covered or glossed over, then do drop it in the comments and I will take a look, and I would love to be able to help you with that as well. But hopefully this is a little bit helpful just so far in you understanding where you stand with PC 1 to 3, and we'll get to 4 and 5 quickly as well. I'm trying to do them faster for you guys to actually get all of these as a group quite quickly. So yeah, as always, I hope it's helpful, guys. Do let me know. Please drop a like on the video if it was helpful, because that helps other people find it. If it's not, tell me how it could be better in the comments as well. Always useful. Thank you for being great. Thanks for subscribing, guys. It's very, very nice to see that you guys are all finding this stuff useful, at least so far. So fingers crossed. Have a great day wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys. And why am I talking about all this in this? Nah, fuck it. Right. That is the wrong place to put that information. Let's start again.